Machiavelli. Oh boy. Recent events have mirrored the doctrine of this book uncannily, though I suspect not with active intent, more by accident. I read The Prince for the first time a few years ago. I thought it was worth another run through. So, as seems to be the form, I'll highlight main points, my experience, had some thoughts, throw in some commentary of contemporary events to ground it out with my own bias and coincidental points I've noticed being played out in real life. It's interesting, eye-opening, and it really reveals that professional politicians are making all the mistakes that Machiavelli advises us not to do. So it is pretty interesting, insightful. We've also mentioned the Dark Triad a couple of times, so I guess we should cross off The Prince and Machiavellian machinations. I think it will provide excellent grounding for the next book I'm looking at, which is How to Win an Election, and explain a little bit about what's going on with the USA and Iran at the moment. We've also mentioned choosing beggars and the Kubler-Ross model, Twitter wars and council cultures. I was wondering if you see the same patterns. So to me, this is novel, and like a gullible first-timer on the internet coming across flat earth trash, I'm all over it like a rash, and I can't wait to share. So maybe for you, it is old news. Maybe not. And then we can recognise when we are doing these patterns and put ourselves at choice point and do something, I was going to say more constructive, but let's just say different. So it's the difference between reacting and responding. Temperance, something Machiavelli lists as definitely a required attribute of a worthy prince. It also occurred to me that this, in fact, is what The Prince is. It's a thinly disguised self-defense manual. Especially as I found out that The Prince has a layout similar to an ancient book on rhetoric. So, as such, I'm not entirely sure who Machiavelli was targeting with this book, the Medici themselves, and thereby subversively encouraging them to reform via a higher, more virtuous ruling strategy by appealing to their aspirations of virtue, or to put this body of knowledge in the hands of the laity so that power would know that the plebs know what games power is playing, and therefore power would need to change its old ways, reform, and, effectively modernise itself. So still to come on the channel, Dave Grossman's on killing, discrimination by design, conflict resolution, and I'd like to get to value and risk and a bit of economics and a few common scams, book on financial scams. Gosh, so much to know and understand. It's the perpetual drive of the INTJ to know more. We got to know it before we do it. But it don't work this way. Such as the torture. This is the vice and virtue of the INTJ type, trust and paranoia. But this is my hang-up and would not wish to project it. I'm sure you have different vices and virtues, something Machiavelli gets onto. Sometimes a vice is a virtue and vice versa. Aha. That paranoia can be useful under protection against, say, social engineering, for example, but it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy that destroys relationships. I mentioned briefly personality types because there is a pattern of distance that seemed relevant, especially when we were talking about power, persuasion, social engineering, which is really what this book is all about. Machiavelli then, in his book, The Prince. Machiavellian behaviours are taken to mean devious, scheming and unscrupulous. Of course, Machiavelli was his surname, and we know and understand that Machiavellian behaviour isn't necessarily pleasant. Sometimes it is, but as a recipient of these machinations, we don't know if the acts are done out of kindness or from a genuine interest or purely coincidentally advantageous to us at our current station in life, that just so happen to be aligned to the machinations of the Machiavellian influence of other agents, or if perceived acts of malice are a perverse cruelty or simply an unfortunate disadvantage to us because of our circumstances and the prevailing conditions that we ascribe to the results of a Machiavellian decision of malice. Or maybe that's just the way it is. And that's a phrase often used by someone called Ted Poe, Judge Ted Poe, a prosecutor in Houston, or used to be, famous for his use of shaming and humiliation sentences. So right off the rip, I'm going to have a diversion. Well, that's what I do. Scatterbrain. So there was this case. A young driver caused an accident, drink driving, killed a young woman. Parents sued, won damages of $1.5 million. The parents offered a deal, though. Instead of the restitution, they wanted paying an amount of $930, something like that, to be paid by cheque, made once a week for 900 weeks, whatever it was. I think the number of weeks was worked out so that it was the same age as the young woman who was killed, her age in weeks. So we kind of get a gist of what's going on here. It's difficult to talk about. I understand the grief and the sense of loss and that horrible void of the parents. I'm sure you know this understanding is only intellectual. There's no way we can imagine what that feels like, and I'm sure parents wanted the drink driver to know. So at first inspection, when I found out about this, it kind of made sense. I sympathised. I did feel a sense of retribution. An infliction upon the young man, such as he had done, seemed justified. Eye for an eye and all that. Through his actions, he had imposed the most disastrous circumstances on people who had no say, had no choice in the matter, no recourse to amends. The loss, the damage, permanent, horrific. But it struck me that the assumption that's being made here is that the kid would react in the same way as the parents, resulting in the young kid having the same sense of loss or reacting to the situation in the same way at the parents' insistence that somehow he would be forced to go through what they were going through. So the punishment of being reminded of that every week seemed to be a device to drive it home once a week for each week of her life that he had taken. That's the way it was viewed, I suppose. Here's the thing though, the kid could have written out 900 post-dated checks over the first weekend, got it over and done with, and then simply posted them or even paid someone else to post them weekly, and then totally forgot about it, plus being relieved of his $1.5 million obligation. Imagine then if this kid had slipped in a handwritten note with each of those checks, a brief note that said, "Enclosed is your check. I imagine you must miss your daughter more this week than you did last week." Surely then the checks arriving every week would cause distress. Probably did anyway, especially with the added note. The point is, the situation seems to be one of who can make the other suffer the most, and so long as they suffer more than me, not only am I justified, but I also feel better knowing that I'm not suffering at least as badly as someone else. So it kind of seems a weird thing, worse, when we believe that the greater good results from our cruelty or vindictive behaviour. So I'm with Walter Wink and Marshall Rosenberg here, experts in the field of conflict resolution. We, the laity, are amateurs and invariably make things worse while convinced we have done a good deed, and no one's going to tell us otherwise. Because who can tell us that our feelings are wrong, and that in these situations of hurt and pain we want others to feel how we feel, but we can never make anyone feel how we feel. But we're pretty sure we're going to have a good go anyway. And that's the thing, no one's going to tell us otherwise. We have to be cajoled and persuaded out of this. Machiavelli knew how. After all, his proposition was how to be an effective prince. No small thing. So what actually happened? Well, the young kid stopped sending checks. The family assumed he had just forgot, which naturally sparked outrage. This is the danger. We think we know. We project onto others our impression of them, and sometimes when we expect the worst of people, that's what's projected. The laity, again, thinking that they're experts in psychology and predictive analysis. We assume people have the same values and beliefs and work the same way that we do, and will therefore be hurt in the same way under the same conditions. It's just not so. So the parents assumed the kid was a heartless monster, who, obviously, held the death of their daughter as something trivial, something easily forgotten. So again, it was interesting to me that the design of this punishment was to reinforce lasting memory, and yet it's the first thing the parents leapt to when the checks stopped coming. They assumed or projected that the young man had simply forgotten. It's difficult, of course. The parents would want to remember, I'm sure. So I find it tricky to talk about. I don't want to trivialise or dishonour anyone's memory, especially under such tragic circumstances. But I've also come to realise that people do have insight and very sophisticated detection equipment in the old grey matter. They know when a punishment and recompense is exceeded to be vindictive malice. And when that line is crossed, we've just given permission to have it tossed back at us for being vindictive and malicious. So what actually happened is that the young kid was so overwhelmed with guilt, he could not bring himself to write the name on the check. Shame and humiliation, redemptive violence, avenged. Congratulations. We've just destroyed another human being. We ought to be cautious then. When it's them, it's called collateral damage. When it's us, we call it friends and family. Oh boy, this conversation can go so wide. It's everywhere, from consequences of stop and search policies in areas of gentrification. There is collateral damage there too. And when, typically, poor people can't afford a lawyer or to play in the game of the rich and powerful, what can we expect? Oh, and just as a check, when I mentioned poor people in urban areas being stopped in search, what picture did you make in your mind? And now that I've asked her, I'm wondering about the family of the daughter that was killed, what kind of family would that be then? And I, for some strange reason in my mind, have the kind of stereotypical middle-class family. And I start to get pictures of the young kid who did the drink drive. Funny, isn't it, how our cognitive preconceptions are fully loaded with stereotypical prejudice. So, turns out there is a link between shame, humiliation and violence. It's a common theme in the histories of the more violent criminals. I've said it before, far too much guilt and shame in the world. And having dipped into a little bit of the far-right groups online, kind of authoritarian groups, neo-Nazis, crypto-fascists, yeah, don't ask me why. I get a sense of pain. It's an unexpressed need that seems to be externalised and projected onto others as their failing. Yeah, always a kind of a theme or a feeling or a notion of some kind of narcissism or solipsism. But it's hard to show sympathy and understanding to these kinds of people who are adopting a more extreme ideology towards fascism. I'm a bit stuck as to the solution. I don't know whether hug a Nazi day, doesn't seem to have good optics. The prevailing wisdom in the blogosphere is that it's okay to punch Nazis in the face, but only in Minecraft, do you understand? I'll maybe come back to that, but the difficulty with Nazis and fascists is that they have no real policies to argue with, no coherent logic to challenge. It itself is an incoherent position. So I must have a bit more of a think on that. Anyway, Machiavelli was not Machiavellian. He just wrote down the instructions, codified how to do it, devoid of whether one ought to or not. In some way, it's a warning. You ought to know. If you play this game, you're all in, and winning and death are the only two possible outcomes. There are no living losers. But then, if we saw his text as like a dare or a challenge to the Medici, we might see it as a Machiavellian plot. This is the thing though, isn't it? So many people have put their interpretation, spin and analysis on it. Context of the times, difficulties in translation. I guess you could spend half a lifetime analysing it. But it seems the long and short is if you are going for gold, then follow this blueprint. To do otherwise is wasteful and creates suffering long term. Far outweighs any short term cruelties. Game of Thrones said it. Play this game to win, to do otherwise is to choose death. Maybe the writers of Game of Thrones have read Machiavelli too, who knows. I'm not big on quoting films, but they do seem to occasionally reflect the zeitgeist for obvious reasons. It's art, right? It's going to reflect back society. Well, when I say art, I mean generally yes, except films by Daniel Farrons. Oh boy. Here we go again with the anti-fragile nature of artists. The naming and shaming seems only to work to their advantage, so I'll leave that one there. Oh yeah, speaking of films, actually, eventually, yes, got to watching Endgame. Wow. Epic. That's crazy. Crazy. It's like a bit of a closure, 10-year storyline. I was a young man when I first watched Iron Man. And just in the last couple of days, RDJ was on Joe Rogan's show. I don't know whether I'll watch that. Looks like fun. Anyway, maybe get around to it one day. Yeah, so the point is, it seems that due to this anti-fragility, artists can't be cancelled. And I suspect it's what we see played out on Twitter today, where even saying particular words will land you in Twitter or Facebook jail, or even being cancelled. I don't like this kind of modern post-millennial use of the word cancelling as meaning beyond the enforcement capacity of a mob. In its modern-day parlance, it's a clinical euphemism. What's really happening is enforced shame, humiliation, bullying, and not just of the target, but of their friends, their family, and anyone else who doesn't comply with the council. It saddens me not to know that public shaming has become sport, but because there are so many people living painful lives with desperation, themselves likely humiliated in the past and suffering pain still to this day, that this moment in time, this is their moment of redemption. They get to feel better by destroying someone else's life. It seems to be a moment for those Twitter users who dogpile in on the so-called cancel to have their moment of retribution against a proxy for their tormentors of the past. So what comes to mind is those murderous convicts that I mentioned a moment ago, having the power to destroy lives, be it via Twitter fuck or a gun in the face. It seems the same thing. I have power, and you must respect my authority and judgment. And through this act, I am vindicated and validated. The fact that I have a gun pointed in your face, or have succeeded in getting you fired from your job without trial or due process, is irrelevant. You should be thanking me for teaching you a lesson about respect. At gunpoint. We've seen it all before. The denial, the assumption that the simulacra, the aesthetic, the simulant is make-believed into the real thing, proxy identifiers are mistaken as the real thing. Power. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Must get to reading Mustard is on power. I've read 48, 33, 50 and Seduction. I don't know. It was a while ago. Maybe I should reread them. So yeah, sure, deplatform, uninvite if you like, but there are many other platforms. And that's the thing, isn't it? Cancelling is an attempt to manipulate those other platforms into compliance. Pre-shaming then? Is that a thing yet? And some of those other platforms, by the way, if you look into who's funding them, oh, Jesus. I mean, you know, we might criticise Twitter and Facebook for deplatforming far-right or extreme views, something which actually I do support, would advocate, especially as they're private corporations and can act their own policies. It's not censorship per se to be in Facebook jail or banned off Twitter, because you can still say what you want to say. No one's stopping you. It's just they're saying not on our platform. And it's not a breach of the constitutional rights, because that only affords protection to the citizens from censorship by the government. Doesn't make any impositions on third parties or private corporations. So what seems to have sprung up is a few other platforms that are funded by right-wing organisations where right-wing extremism ends up going. So yeah, I see the response to this. You know, the mob has realised shame and humiliation does get a result, sometimes faster than due process. So each of these wins or losses, depending on which way you're looking at it, from the cancel culture perspective, I suppose, just emboldens the mob rule to deplatform with a hashtag. And with great power comes great responsibility, blah, blah, blah. But it's so difficult. I used to follow a chap on the YouTubes that debunked science bunkum and ridiculous crowdfunding projects that were actually impossible. If you did a few basic calculations, you'd realise thermodynamically or whatever, it's just impossible. But it had, you know, the presentations had flashy graphics, whiz-bang presentations, high production value, high-quality CGI, and narrated with a smooth, vaguely Nordic accent, giving it a real air of authenticity and honesty. Yeah, so these projects, these crowdfunding really annoyed me because they just seem to be fleecing a generally ignorant public on the hope of solving a world problem. You know, some of them were, you know, take, say, for example, water out of air. And the idea was you can put these in any places on the world that needs water that doesn't have pipeline infrastructure. Great idea, something we can all get behind. Just, you know, helping other people, solving big problems, but it doesn't fucking work. Plus the fact that some of these presentations really turn the thumb screws on the emotional content and kind of a first world guilt to tell stories about how this child or how this family has to walk 10 miles just to get water from a dirty infested swamp. Of course we don't like to see that kind of suffering, so of course we're going to support this project. But the point is, the project doesn't help. So what's happening is a company's putting out their presentation. The product's not actually made or designed, it's a CGI model. They're making the claim that this will work, and then they're pulling on your emotional heartstrings to, you know, help people live that otherwise would die of thirst or poor sanitary conditions or no available water. So you give them money, and they take the money, either knowing full well that the project will never work, or worse, in ignorance that the project will never work. And it turns out sometimes some of these projects are actually put together by art students and not actually technical engineers. So it seems even worse that there is a real scam going on here, that someone somewhere behind the scenes has conned or cajoled a naive young person who says, you know, I've got some decent CGI skills and I want to change the world. And someone says, well, why don't you do a presentation of this project I'm working on? We'll crowdfund it and our skills together will help save the world. And so they go, yeah, great. And then they put their name all over it. And the dark shadowy figure in the background that knows better takes a share of the crowdfunding, knowing full well it's totally fraudulent. And then the young kid takes all the blame, takes the fall, and they carry the bankruptcy while their friend has now disappeared. That's just my speculation as to what's going on. But so this guy, yeah, the YouTuber, used to come along and debunk these videos saying, stop putting your money into these projects that don't work, can't work, and will never work. In essence, slightly more sophisticated versions of the free energy device that big energy companies have hidden from view, built by Tesla back in the day, blah, 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 Westinghouse, blah, 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 JP Morgan, blah, 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 banking cartels. So yeah, anyway, the debunker was quite good at it, quite thorough. He gave a good analysis of the proposed projects and showed why it couldn't work. And he took pleasure in it as well and gained good following from the pawnage back when that was a thing. Eventually, though, he too got the cancel culture treatment. And he used to get a lot of pushback from these projects he was debunking. And the messages from these people from the projects was just pitiful, because it was basically saying, this project will work. All you've got to do is believe. And, you know, your lack of faith has ruined this project. It's like, no, mate, it's science, you know. you're not going to get 10 gallons of fresh water from desert air because it's just not humid enough. And besides, the device you're making is called a dehumidifier, which you can go on Amazon and buy right now, that's more efficient than the one that you're proposing to make, and cheaper. So, that was the state of things. Anyway. So, I mean, that came in, so I kind of built up this resistance to him being criticised. It's like, oh, this is another lunatic going on about if only had faith or only believed. So, it kind of like inoculated me against seeing criticism of this guy. And then the criticism started coming against other subjects. I thought, this is weird. He had some political commentary, some social issues, and he had quite a thing for going after what he perceived as social justice warriors. You know, he's trying to use science to deconstruct social science. But when he got far out of his wheelhouse, what he was saying was actually totally wrong. Turns out, slippery slope, and it turns out he was a bully, and some of his technical takedowns now in retrospect, while technically accurate, did have an aroma of sadistic pleasure. His identity politics was appalling. Oh, God. Blimey. Some of the things he said about... Well, anyway, I'll just leave it there, but it was horrendous. Raises a question, though. Ought he be deplatformed? So it depends, doesn't it? Is he debunking these fraudulent, CGI-powered, so-called science projects that can never work? Sure, go ahead, save people's money, bring awareness to the fraud. Or is he talking about how there's no such thing as rape? Back to that old problem that I think we mentioned before, you know, the intent of the filmmaker, what they get up to outside of their art, and then whether we should watch their art and give money to watch it, which not only funds them, but also funds a lot of people that spent a lot of time making that movie that are now going to be punished for the actions of someone else over which they had no control. I don't know, morals and ethics. Get onto that later. So yeah, it turns out deplatforming does work. You know, deplatforming the fascists, Nazis and KKK has had meaningful impact. So yeah, it seems like it's a valid tool. Like any other tool, the only thing that separates it from being a weapon is harm to do intent. Harm to do intent. Yeah, obviously. Better for Freudian go there. Intent to do harm. So then, next question. Those that have clear intent to do harm, moralistically, ought to be stopped by any means? There's that question again. What about those who do harm through ignorance? And what about those who know they're doing good things but are actually deluded and causing great damage? I raised this question again briefly at the end of this audio series when we look at the differences in sentencing between the psychopaths who have done murders and non-psychopaths who have also done murders. It seems that those out of control who are just reacting out of passion or anger seem to get more lenient sentences, whereas those who've planned it, calculated it, and exercised a certain amount of deliberate intent get punished even more. In either case, the outcome is disastrous. And I think the liars who know the truth are less dangerous than the deluded ones. And yeah, there's delusion again. So it's been said, Facebook is where we go to lie to our friends, and Twitter is where we tell the cold hard truth to strangers. Instagram is where our soul goes to die and all gets converted to cash. YouTube's still not sure. Yeah, I mean, good, bad, same old story. So I'd have thought the cancel campaigners ought to have come up with a stronger argument than just hashtag. Calling someone a racist or bigot doesn't make them one. Okay, they may well be, and in some cases the evidence is clear. And they've said some pretty shitty things and advocated for some horrible and putrid policies and put into the minds of younger and naive people that there's nothing wrong with doing those things. But outrage culture and oversensitivity to pandering to the mob makes it a tricky situation, muddies the waters. Sometimes I just can't tell anymore. Ambiguity, but this I've realised is a hang-up of mine. So yeah, the effectiveness of deplatforming, of course, has not gone unnoticed. Turns out, it seems that many crimes, even quite bad ones, are in the end forgivable if the perpetrator begs for forgiveness, shows remorse, corrects their ways, makes amends, does sufficient stretch at Her Majesty's pleasure. It seems that there is redemption at the end of it all, but there are, it seems, some crimes we've talked about in earlier videos that simply are not forgivable. And knowing this, throwing shade, using social media and making false allegations and unwarranted accusations of such crimes to discredit and incite moral outrage against the target also happens more, it seems, than from time to time. I don't know what Elon Musk was thinking, but apparently it's just an insult. So yeah, we can go around calling people those things. It's just an insult. It seems, though, to pull this off, the counsellor needs to have a threshold number of followers who can trigger a viral effect to propagate the message. So rather than these followers asking for clarification, no, the judgment is made, sentence is passed, and the mob dog piles in under a putrid fuckfest of self-congratulatory and self-confirmation. No evidence is required. Should be, though. Sometimes maybe it is. And I reckon this adds credence to the claim that this is an act of redemptive violence to avenge a previous wrong done to them by someone else. As Walter Wink points out in his book about redemptive violence, no one learns anything except how nasty people can be. So this circle jerk of dogpiling traps people. It just reinforces their preconceived notions in an out-of-control feedback system. So this is a little bit outside of Machiavelli's The Prince, but it strikes me as relevant because it seems to support the notion that when people do things we don't understand, that are beyond our experience and outside our own little scope of wonder, it's the unfamiliar, the unknown, and the fear. We then condemn the other, reject the other, distance ourselves from the other and the situation, rather than taking a step in there and learning something new. Distance. Or engagement. Yeah, so I want to get to Grossman's book on killing. Distance, mental distance, physical distance, cultural distance, mechanical distance, technological and ideological distance. It's part of the conditioning treatment to widen these distances so much that one human being will simply not see the other as human, but a thing, a number on a spreadsheet to be deleted, removed, cancelled. And sometimes just read the messages of hate written by the shamers in a council campaign. They're not even complaining about the same thing. Each brings their own slant or grievance about the alleged transgressor's behaviour. Some will say the crime committed was anti-American. Some will say it's disrespectful to some group or other. Some will say it makes her a bad mother. Some will say it's because of feminism or some other terrorist group. Others because she's a fascist. Well, it's incoherent. And little actually to do with anything, as far as I can tell. I suspect it's projection and reveals more about the shamers than the transgressor. If this is the only way that they can self-validate, they're in need too. We all are, I guess, but no one has that amount of spare empathy, not on that magnitude. It's a feedback thing. Test, operate, test, exit, cybernetics, reflexive feedback, chaotic feedback, or stabilising feedback. We've touched on these themes: fight, flight, freeze, appease, submit, so on. Violence begets violence. I'm reminded of Virginia Satir and her family therapy model and the drama triangle, where one apex just feeds into the next, that feeds into the next, and round and round and round it goes. In modern parlance, it's like a little trigger triangle. It seems we're all being drawn into the reflexive project of the self, the disintegration of communities, the inescapable presence of electronic media, the growing influence of distance happenings on our everyday lives, the bewildering array of lifestyle options. All these factors force us to choose who we are in a way that previous generations never had to. Well, there's a quote I recently came across that seemed apt. I'm not sure I noted down who it was. The world at first seen by the child becomes his lifelong standard of excellence, mindless of the fact that they are admiring the ruins of their parents. Generation to generation, the natural world decays, the ratchet of perception tightens. Gradually, imperceptibly, big sharks give way to small sharks. Small sharks to bait fish to jellyfish, jellyfish to slime. So yeah, it seems almost as though these shamers are finding an ideological or cultural aspect to get hold of, to latch onto, to exaggerate a distance. We use these terms: bleeding heart liberals, right-wing fascists, terrorists, feminists, to disengage with them, to distance ourselves from them, then pile on a contempt, which seems to validate the violence. Yeah, so I don't have a Twitter account. I never got it. I did read somewhere in the literature that there is an optimum length of sentence that results in a maximal ambiguity, and it's about 140 characters. So I understand Twitter's changed a bit since then. But when I found that out, I kind of realised Twitter's a shit show. Some people, I don't get it. With that level of ambiguity, it seems to lend itself to misunderstandings, polarising attitudes. You either assign negativity to the ambiguity or positivity. It seems if you're constantly holding judgment on these short sentences, that it's either a meaningless exercise or the ambiguity eventually surely becomes maddening. In other words, it almost forces you to take a side. Maybe that's why Twitter's done so well. Seems a strange place to stay when you constantly reserve judgment on constantly ambiguous messages. It would drive me mad, and that's why I hate the word thingy. I try and make sense of meaning when people use this word, and after a day of constantly hearing about the thing, pass me the thing, and the thingies, and I've lost my thingy, and the thingy, I'm exhausted trying to make sense of it all. I hold high value on communication, so I find myself compelled to listen and try and make meaning of what they're saying. Eventually, I have to say to my torturer, either be more specific, or for my own sanity, I'm just going to stop listening. Pick one. They don't like that. And what's more infuriating and frustrating is when I try and impose upon them how I feel by using their own strategy against them and say things like, oh, the thing is by the thingy where you left it when you had the other thingy. It seems fine with them, and they understand exactly what I mean. Or are comfortable with the ambiguity, or just don't care, I can't tell. And that ambiguity is also frustrating. Yeah, I'm sure if you have thick skin or a fantastic ability to somehow mind read intended meanings of ambiguous messages, it's not for me. I always somehow get the wrong end of the stick. But this is my failing. I'm sure you've spotted it. Neutrality. I ride the lines rather than polarize. However, polarizing the following, the electorate, the mob, is strategically prudent. We'll get on to that. Besides, to optimize the Twitter experience, it seems that you need a lot of auxiliary tools. It's a lot of time. It's up to you. Enact a conservative, totalitarian social space if you like. One day, it could be you on the other end. The vampires eventually will need fresh blood one day. So I've recently accounted for all this stuff by getting back into the personality types, the Myers-Briggs stuff. Seems INTJ types are tolerant of ambiguity and don't necessarily have to come down on one side or another. I was also reading about something, I hate these hacking phrases, life hacking, ego hacking is a new thing. Well, it's not a new thing, it's a new label. Interesting stuff. I'm sure you've heard it all before. Read Kevin Mitnick's book a few years ago, and I'd read Counter Knowledge a few years back, and there was another one, social engineering. Yeah, it might have been social engineering. There was a phrase in there that sticks out. It's like, when you want to get access to a building, for example, and it's late at night, you phone up, anybody who answers the phone, you say, oh, hi, it's so-and-so down at the front door. Yeah, I've left my pass in my desk. Could you buzz me in? Obviously, they're going to go, no, can't buzz you in. You need your pass. So how do you escalate and call their bluff? You could say something like, well, if you go over to my desk and have a look in the drawer, you'll see my pass in there. Of course, you don't want them to actually do that, because if they do go to the desk and open the drawer, they'll find that there's no pass, and you are not actually an employee of the company, and they'll be busted. So you want to give them the illusion that you're prepared for them to do that thing. And of course, an intruder would never want them to do that. So you say something like, well, yeah, go and fetch my pass from my drawer in this cubicle location. Well, using that kind of language, go and fetch, is what we tell dogs to do. And no one likes being talked to like a dog. So they'll refuse your request. But at the same time, they're now in a dilemma, because they either have to act like a dog and go and verify for themselves whether you are an intruder or not, or they have to not do that thing, which infers a belief that you're telling the truth, and the only consistent behaviour with that is to buzz you in. You can see why it's got the nickname ego hacking. Social engineering, as it was called back when I was young. So yeah, well, we've come a long way in terms of technology and security since then. But the weak points in these technological marvels is the human being. In 2019, the most popular password is still Law of Averages says you already have this as one of your passwords. So friggin' change it. And then, surprisingly, some research polls suggest that 42% of us are worried about online security and online banking. Well, I'm not surprised if you're using the same frigging password as everyone else. Yeah, so gaining entry to secure systems and executing industrial espionage is now easier to do by hacking people and using techniques of persuasion to get them to reveal the secrets. It's a lot easier than hacking these systems. So yeah, I mean, it's relevant because kind of this is what The Prince is all about. Persuasion, or manipulation, whichever term you prefer. Counselling. It uses the veneer of the now perverted meaning of political correctness to hide what people actually mean by counselling. Counselled is the euphemism or socially accepted way of saying trashed, or to make threats of harm, and not necessarily just to the target, but to the target's family, workplace, with a good dose of doxing. It means to inflict humiliation, shame and disgrace, placing people into a public frame of contempt which makes it easy for others to condemn. It's a process of conditioning, just like Dave Grossman's on-killing process. Well, still, there seems to be sport in trawling through 10 or 15 years of tweets to find the one that can be used, fished from history, cherry-picked, straw-manned and wrapped around a black and white thinking fallacy. Machiavelli surely would not have imagined such power, nor such cowardice. The punishment for such contemptuous behaviour of princes back then was severe, and as we shall see, this is not advocated punishment, but natural consequences of being so indulgent in our feelings and evening the score just to feel good. Machiavelli would surely see this effort for such little reward a petty waste of resources. This is not a game for petty emotional feels. I'm sure you've heard the odd business guru complain about the snowflakes, but this comparison is disingenuous. It's the argument, say for example the notions of Marx, where from each according to their means and to each according to their needs. A capitalist wise to this game would hold the communist to account and say, I always need more. Is this fair? Well, the capitalist easily mocks the communist for being a snowflake and not adhering to their own doctrine of giving to the needy, and I'm not a billionaire yet, so I'm needy. They just don't see the moral constraint. These guys are playing to reach their own ends. The others adhere to the means, and one will exhaust the resources of the other until they can give no more, and then the latter will have the audacity to say, see, communism doesn't work. Snowflakes are crying about how unfair it all is. This is the caution in Orwell's book Animal Farm, but it seems often the wrong conclusions are drawn, or worse, purposefully misrepresented, that socialistic-centric politics don't work, but the actual message is that constant revolution is required to prevent power accumulating and exhausting the system as described. It seems to me, having reread The Prince, that Machiavelli is advocating a careful balance of power. It's not even necessarily about having power, but having a hand on those scales that can sway it one way or another. Anyway, this is it, the ends and the means. Here we are, the Machiavellian question. So, Machiavelli, I'm not going to say Machiavelli every time, I'm going to call him Mac or Mackie or Mac. Mac was born in 1469, fucking ages ago. Long story short, he eventually wound up as a political advisor, both concerned with internal and external affairs of Florence. He was not a politician per se, but I suppose today's equivalent would be foreign secretary, and in this kind of advisory role, he had more or less a permanent fixture at the centre of the political flux. More like a civil servant, I guess, than a partisan politician. So he would accompany ambassadors on diplomatic missions to Alderaan. I always wanted to say that. No, he wouldn't go to Alderaan, but he would go to on diplomatic missions. So he was kind of a negotiator or treaty builder. Nevertheless, he was kind of like the real deal, the real Napoleon Hill. By the way, just to put it on record, Napoleon Hill was a bit of a fraud, a bit of a scamster. He didn't meet all those people, and for such a momentous or milestone event in the self-help movement, Carnegie's biography has no mention of a Napoleon Hill, conspicuous by its absence. However, Machiavelli did travel, and he met many kings, queens, and people of power. He met the big wigs of his day. I must check my temporal metaphors. I'm sure the big wigs came later, about 100 years later. That's an interesting story for another day, though. Same old thing. But yeah, our boy was meeting with the kings and queens of his day, interacting directly with heads of state and high-ranking diplomats. He certainly travelled. Over the course of these missions, Mac realised Italy was actually vulnerable to military attack from greater forces. Interesting side note, and relevant to today's issues in certain regions of the Middle East. Before Machiavelli, the Medici had been kicked out. See, this is where the Roman Empire was superior. Be sure to integrate those who you conquer, get them to pay taxes and homage to you, and give them jobs and responsibilities that actually enables you, so that you can give them what they need, render to Caesar and all that. Yeah, I think Bob Iger understood this well. See previous 5 videos. What we don't do, though, is instigate an apartheid or second-class citizenry who are kept in more or less open concentration camps with no voting rights while annexing land and building on that against UN regulations. Machiavelli specifically notes it's harder to govern countries with different cultures and languages. He suggests for success to go and live there in those lands you've seized, establish a few colonies in a few places, let the gaps fill in, as it were, organically, protect the neighbouring minor powers and try to weaken those with excessive power. Kind of, again, refer back to the book we looked at last time, Bob Iger, a similar kind of thing. Surely, tension is highest when the disparity in things like power and resources is high. Yeah, maybe we'll get onto force projection. I was reading a bit about that in terms of military tactics. Basically, there's a trade-off between use of force and topological distance. That is, keeping force supplied with fuel and food and resources to maintain its effective presence is costly, and it's a cost that doesn't rise linearly. The further away, the more expensive it is. Just for example, one that I remember from history, the UK's bombing campaign in the Falkland Islands, where they bombed a runway at Port Stanley. I believe it required fueling jets to fuel other fueling jets that fueled the bombers. Such was the range. Yeah, a bit of a sensitive issue, kind of the point to the example, but keeping a standing army and deployed over long distances becomes increasingly expensive to a point where it costs more than it's worth, yet you're compelled to do it just to keep other people out. There's that institutional imperative again. And as the Florentines found out, the Medici returned with new and more powerful friends. The fall of the Republic marked the end of Machiavelli's diplomatic career, though to be clear, it wasn't his actions or necessarily his policy that precipitated it. It was kind of happening all the while. He was on the scene, as it were. There's a bit more to his life story, obviously, but sometime after his diplomatic career, he wrote his treatise, The Prince, a book on what we might call statecraft. The original title in Latin translated meant of principalities. The Prince, written 1513. It may also not be a coincidence that in The Prince, that Machiavelli's final call to action is to retake power from the Medici. And so perhaps he felt guilty or shamed or blameful in some way that he had not forewarned sufficiently. He's also critical of the ways in which the Medici operated their statecraft. I mention this because one of the main tactics of persuasion is smearing and denigration of the incumbent to weaken its power base or to destroy its credibility, to make it seem a bit contemptuous, such that those with an eye to seize power or retake a state have no qualms about enacting any means to recapture what was lost, especially against a contemptible usurper. At the time, a conspiracy to out the returning Medici was uncovered, and Machiavelli was suspected as being involved. He denied it, resisted torture, and was eventually set free. So it gives the book a little bit of a subversive edge. And then we're faced with the problems we raised in the previous 5 videos. Author intent, like a retiring CEO. Is it the case that they're setting down their legacy in the book and preserving the rose-tinted version, or is it a cautionary tale, or is it a subversive joke? A way to get back at all those that wronged you along your path to the top, and now that you're retiring you can tell all. I can't imagine that a successful high-end CEO would do it for the money, but perhaps the failed, broken and incompetent ones might, I suppose. It seems too that the book was criticised at the time, met with moral indignation, and I suppose had Twitter existed back then, no doubt The Prince would have been cancelled. And then there's where the term Machiavellian came from. And here there's a delirious Freudian slip. Did I mean delicious or devious? Yeah, both. Delirious is a new word. Yeah, there's a delirious irony in the criticism. Machiavelli was branded an atheist, and his first name became associated with Old Nick himself. Yeah, he himself was made a target of contempt, to be discredited and shunned in exactly the same way as his text gives instruction. Thus, the outrage and adverse publicity of an artist or an author, as we know, only fuels the hunger for people to know what the fuss is all about. Here we are, 500 years later. It's also worth keeping in mind that the successful politician or prince requires the good faith of the people. Should the text reveal what the career politician is really all about, amoral, opportunistic, and executors of raw power, much like the vampire tropes we mentioned a few videos ago, the people might begin to realise that any benefits they receive were actually happy coincidences, and that at any moment this good fortune could be wiped out by the prince instigating a change in search for new blood or more power, or more taxes, or coincidentally having their military land at refuelling stations that just happen to be near one of your hotels. So yeah, while rereading I noticed certain parallels, things I was reading about Twitter and Facebook, perception and projection. It's the same pattern, human nature, predictably irrational. So over many years, The Prince has been analysed and touted as a book about this or that, which reveals more about the reader and the critic than the source material. Again, something we covered in the 2-parter on Francis Bacon, the painter, talking about his critics. Likewise, the moral outrage and righteous indignation we see expressed on Twitter, Facebook, and this new cancel culture. I made mention of the notion that while short messages are typically ambiguous, the polarizing effects are actually desirable for the OP, original poster. Machiavelli notes that there are those who do not commit to either support or attack the OP. And sometimes there are a couple of reasons for this. The first is timidity, in which case you can use these followers. They will always come to your support while they are aligned and either sheltered by you or get benefit from what you're doing. But should you fall out of favour with this group, because they are timid, they will not resist. The second reason is that the supporters or followers think more of themselves than that of the original poster, in which case they will not lack courage and will attack the OP in the OP's time of need. Game theory. And rhetoric, then, persuasion. It's no real mystery. The art of persuasion. To get started, there's 3 things that are required. I've mentioned it before when talking about hypnosis. You know, the old drill: relax, take a deep breath, and place hands on lap. There's an invitation to slow down, to be attentive and receptive. These early instructions are really a compliance test where the hands are placed is irrelevant. It's a test to see if the recipient is, as Machiavelli describes, well disposed, attentive, and receptive. There's no point in proceeding until these states have been achieved. Even George Belford has this bit down. And Steve Scott, in his book Mentored by a Millionaire, talked of the hook, salt, and emotional word picture. Dave Trott, in his predatory marketing, says the same thing. I think we covered that a few videos back. Impact, communication, persuasion. You can't persuade without communicating. You can't be communicating unless you're being heard. And you can't be heard unless someone is receptive, and they're not receptive until they're attentive. And to get attention, we need impact. Yeah, the old clickbait. Find out why I paid 2.7 million for a house that was valued at just $3,000. You know there's a story there, and you know there's a catch, but can you tell what it is yet? Yeah, same thing as I talked about the preamble before. It's a nice opening gambit to circumvent apprehension and resistance. So if you want someone to relax and they're coming to you to be relaxed, you can say something totally stupid like, before we start, take a deep breath and relax. Now, what was it you were here for? It's all done before we even start. It's all in the preamble, the exordium. So our first task is to render the reader or the interlocutor well disposed and attentive. Me, I'm just too fucking lazy. Francis Bacon said it though, just don't bore people. I mean, consider his art in that context. It wasn't boring, far from it. Certainly shocking for its day. It got people's attention. But we did that one already a few videos ago. So he too knew how to leverage power. Before we get started, we need to mention the book on persuasion. The one that started it all. Not Dan Kennedy, not Eugene Schwartz, not Ogilvy, not the Little Blue Books. Nah, we're going back. 2,000 years, baby. Rhetorica ad Herennium. Often misattributed to Cicero as the author, but actually of unknown authorship, the book lays out steps to persuasion. Funnily enough, it's pretty close to the 8-step learning format taught in contemporary presentation skills seminars and stuff like that. You know, nothing under the sun. I mean, if it works, it works. These patterns are going to emerge, but they're also going to get, rebranded or a new name. I don't know, social engineering, ego hacking, health and fitness, biohacking. Whatever. Yeah, to make it clear, Rhetorica ad Herennium goes into a lot of detail on rhetoric, presentation, both oral and written. I admit, I barely skimmed through it. But page 70, part 3, or page 9 in part 3 lists the 6-step process. Quite self-explanatory. Step 1, introduction, prepares the reader's mind. Step 2, statement of the facts. List what is known, make data points explicit. Step 3, division or breakdown. List what matters are agreed upon and which are contentious. Point 4, proof, laying out the evidence in support of the claim along with the supporting argument. And I'm sure I've said what evidence is before. Step 5, refutation, refute our adversaries' counter-arguments. And finally, conclusion, with a call to action, with a commensurate dollop of urgency. Rhetorica breaks down the introduction into 3 stages, requiring attentive, receptive, and well-disposed listeners or readers. And as a side note, I'm going a bit too much into the details now, but the text also points out the speaker or writer should be competent in invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And of course, the author, whoever they may be, encourages us that the means of acquiring these skills are theory, study, imitation, copy other people, practice, do it over and over. And what's that saying about practice? And amateur practices until they get it right, professional practices until they can't get it wrong, or whatever. So yeah, I mean, even the greats started by copying their masters, and even some of the masters in art were actually master forgers who had patrons who would knowingly pay for works. For its age, though, Rhetorica is sophisticated. Even people of 2,000 years ago were as smart as we are today. It's just today we've got better tools and greater specialisms. But in the cognitive processes of the human being, I can't imagine we're that much different. So it didn't go unnoticed that there are different styles required for being persuasive in different circumstances. So the first question is, when defending or doing a sale or making an effort at persuasion, you've got to ask yourself, who's the target audience? What's the subject that we're trying to convince people of? And in regard to that, is the subject matter honourable? That is to say, are we defending a cause that affects all men, women, people? Is it a subject that's somewhat discreditable? That is to say, when something honourable itself is under attack and we're defending that? Or are we trying to argue the case for something doubtful that's partly honourable and pretty discreditable? Or are we arguing for something that's petty, which has no consequence and generally unimportant? So the aim of the introduction is to make the listener or reader attentive, receptive and well disposed. Rhetorica suggests 4 ways of grabbing that initial attention. First way, by discussing our own person. We see this on the internet today, people schlonging their own qualifications and expertise in the matter, their qualifications, their time in the field, the number of successful results they've had, blah, blah, blah. I'm an expert, therefore you should listen to me. Number 2, we talk about our adversary in the matter. We describe them as a shitlord, as being irresponsible, as having no qualifications. We throw shade at our opponent, basically. We try to discredit them. Again, Irving Younger, go and watch his videos on YouTube, talks about how to do cross-examinations brilliantly. 3, we talk about our audience. We give our audience a fine reputation to live up to. This is very much in the style of Christopher Hitchens. And because they're such a sophisticated and well-read audience, we tell them that, of course, their conclusion is obvious. I don't need to explain to the audience why this is so obvious. They already know to do it that way. Number 4, list the facts. Cool, hard logic. We use cool, hard logic or facts if they're available and if they paint our adversary or the position we're trying to discredit in a bad light. So if data just doesn't support the other's claim, use data. And this is where you can get into line with statistics. Puts the idea that the opposition is contemptuous because they've lied to the audience. This is where kind of conspiracy theories get started a little bit, because it's like, we can say something like, that old fable, chimpanzees throwing darts at a piece of paper with stock tickers on it, and we go and buy and sell that stock that was pierced by the dart thrown by a chimp. On average, this method of stock selection actually outperforms professional investors. Alright, it's funny, it's humorous, and it builds a certain amount of contempt for these professionals to whom we're paying our fees. Yet the truth of the matter is in the data, as always, and broken down, I can't remember the figures, it's something like 3% of investor professionals, money managers, make a fuck ton of money. When I say make, they manage to reassign funds into their own bank account, whatever. 5% think about break even, and the rest generally lose money. So it's not on average it looks bad, but if you can find the right professional investor, your fees are more than justified. However, the industry's been besmirched, and all of a sudden we get big pharma, big medicine, big government, all tarred with that very simplistic analysis. And then once we've besmirched or made contemptuous the authority body, like in the example of the social engineering of trying to blag your way into an office by telling someone to go and fetch your security badge, which they don't like to do, now that we've removed the authority or the expert from the equation, who's the only other person that they're going to go to for their solution? Kind of only really leaves you. But as we warned in Iger's Ride of a Lifetime, don't push too hard, because just because they've agreed to sell or buy doesn't mean that it's going to be from you. And here Rhetorica has a good advice for us as well. It adds that we have a direct approach to things and a subtle approach to things. Say, for example, we're defending a kind of discreditable notion. We ought to use a subtle approach. I guess an example of this would be is where we try to defend, let's say it's a court case or something, and as a particularly unpleasant person who's done all sorts of horrible things, not illegal, but horrible things, and is now actually up for murder. So the direct approach would be, although my client is a thief, a philanderer, has affairs, doesn't make good on his promises, that doesn't make him a murderer. Yeah. It's got to come at a slightly more subtle approach. Well, this is perhaps why I'm thinking about it now. Bob Iger's book where, what was it, Disney War? Bob, you need to start a charity to redeem your character. There we go. Plants the seed. 6 months later, when the court case comes, oh yeah, it's not all bad. He's been running this charity. There's a lot of good come out of that. So there are redeemable characters, traits within my client. It's that kind of thing. In regard to introducing the facts, Rhetorica again has some excellent ways of doing it. 1, wrapped in a narrative that supports our outcome. 2, do by using disparagement of the adversary or unfavoured outcome. 3, in terms of an emotive or cautionary tale. Kind of like a Star Wars thing happened somewhere, sometime in a galaxy far, far away. It's kind of like more of a metaphor or a story, an anecdote. Or you can actually use a tragedy that really did occur, but actually isn't linked directly to our case, like the drunk driver story told earlier, which is kind of like a warning of the form of the things that might come as a consequence of the facts, data, evidence, decisions that will be made. In any case, the facts should be brief, clear, and plausible. Something I need to work on. I like to digress too much. It's all interlinked. In regards to the division phase, this is really sorting out the controversial points and clarifying what actually is an agreement. Interestingly, Rhetorica states that after this we should use enumeration and exposition. That is, we list out how many points we're going to discuss. How many? What's the maximum? Come on. How many priorities are there? That's right, just 3, no more. And the exposition sets forth the points we intend to discuss. In modern parlance, before you tell them what you're about to tell them. Next is proof and refutation. Yeah, going a bit too in depth. Machiavelli had access to this book, and the structure of The Prince itself follows the prescribed format for Persuasion as directed by Rhetorica ad Herennium. So with this, in the book, The Prince, Mackie starts off by making an offering, paying homage to the fact that we, the reader, have opened his book. So it's pacing current undeniable experience, just like we do with hypnosis. Pace current experience, and then slowly get more ambiguous, and then we slowly start to lead. People don't notice the switch from pacing to leading if it's done subtly enough. So what could Machiavelli grant us, the reader, in return for our attention? All of his belongings, all that he values, all that he has, everything of worth, it is own very experience in statecraft. And since we have been gracious enough to read the opening paragraph, so shall we be rewarded with the collective knowledge of many princes who have succeeded and some who failed. And this is itself another subtle trick. He also has to overcome the issue of writing a book about statecraft under the rule of the returning Medici. And, as highlighted in Bob Iger's book, this is the problem of where the number 2, who followed the instructions of their number 1, the previous head honcho, as loyalty and command structures demand, but where number 1 is misguided and brings the organisation to its knees, number 1 is eventually ousted, and now number 2 is in a very precarious position. The usual questions are asked. Why did you not stop number 1 if you knew better? Were you therefore part of it? Why did number 1 fail? What would you have done differently? What bad habits have you picked up from him or her? So here, distancing is a tactical move. In other words, a subtle or oblique approach is required as prescribed in the Rhetorica book. In this situation, the direct and authoritarian approach isn't available. Machiavelli's old administration had just been overthrown. So this is one of those positions of discreditedness. I might be right, circumstances have conspired, but that just doesn't mean to say that all I've learned over the last 30, 40 years should be thrown out just because the last event we look at, just puts barely a dent in the statistics. But, of course, recency bias. My client might be a shitty human being, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's done the murder. So, Machiavelli can't use the direct approach as described. It's not available to him. So he has to introduce his expertise in spite of the fact of the loss. He also was not a prince. So how can he possibly advise those superior to him in station? He starts by listing his good services, his competence. He schlongs himself. He also tells of the adversity that he's gone through to acquire the knowledge. He reframes his lowly status as actually having advantage in offering a perception that a prince would never, should never experience, that of a low-life scum that actually has a unique perception of princes, whereas princes only have perceptions of people and seldom reliable external reference points. All people, sensible, self-serving people, tell the prince what it is they think he wants to hear, never the truth. It completes the picture for the prince, and this honest, distance, nothing to lose or gain position is offered to give the reader, the potential prince, a perspective while saving him from the harrowing inconvenience of having to live like a low-life piece of shit. So previously we've talked about moral outrage and righteous indignation, the sport of finding one tweet that's problematic, appealing to the masses at the outrage and harm that this single message is imagined to do, and it behooves us to be better. And we have an obligation, nay, a duty, to set this person right. And should we attribute a label to them and dehumanize them, it will be easy to show contempt and then so easy to do a violence. And easy for others to follow suit, because who's going to defend the contemptuous? Perhaps there is a lesson here about how we ought to respond rather than react. Reacting often trips us into dehumanizing ourselves and placing us at the mercy of the other, who is now morally justified, as has recently played out in the Middle East. This is a tool Rhetorica suggests that in an argument or persuasion effort, if we throw shade, place our opponent into a position that adjudicators will find contemptuous, we only need to step back and witness the ensuing violence against them. So escalate this little pattern to the world stage and it sounds a little bit like you're either with us or with the terrorists, or some other rhetoric of just actions. And at the time of writing, perhaps even a preemptive strike on a foreign national who happens to be the de facto number 2 in power, on the pretense of preventing something from starting, because they are wicked people. And we are obligated, nay, duty-bound, to ensure democracy isn't threatened. I had to laugh at Lindsey Graham's commentary on justifications of the extrajudicial killings, and that the imminent threat was unspecified, not to be divulged to Congress, but the information obtained was by means of magic. What a dickhead. Here again, the question, do the means justify the ends? Now it seems we don't even need justification. Yeah, just one more subtle slide towards a fascist regime. But only because we're on the inside of this one, we don't see it. I'm sure you've noticed too the uprising of the cult of greatness. That one man, it's usually a man, one great man, destined to be a born leader. A perverse kind of return to the divinity of kings, or at least elected officials who think that their confirmation seats them in a throne of divinity and arbitrary rule. On another side note, amendments to the bill to give ministers the power to instruct judges on how to interpret the law. Wow. These self-ordained types seem to be popping up here and there. It's weird, just something I noticed. And these folk imagine that they are sovereign and not required to justify or even give reasons for their actions. They're on a mission from God, I suppose. And as you've noticed, this cult of personality is all about emotional attachment, perhaps even through some sense of bonded identity with the leader. Or would it be too obvious to say, dear leader? And I'm not talking about North Korea. The prince has to engage the public's emotions, this is true, motivate them both away from the cause of what the terrorists, rebels or fifth columnists are up to, and towards the right thing to do, which of course is what those in current power want, whatever that is. Don't let logic or reason get in the way. Give them a distraction. It's magic, bro. How do magnets work? Don't. Another distraction and another. Walls, tariffs, ad hoc drawings on weather maps and washing machines, water restrictions and toilet flushing, fireworks, and what else has he talked about? It's all distraction, bullshit stuff. You know, never mind that people's water supply catches fire literally because of methane gas ingress or lead leaching from old and worn out infrastructure. Any old bullshit is a distraction, yeah. Let's raise £500,000 to ring Big Ben because, oh look, bright shiny object. While I'm at it, it seems to be pervasive in the big Hollywood films of the moment. Plot holes. Oh, you watching movies wrong. Covered up by shizzle and special effects, and you don't see the sleight of hand. Quick, another boss fight. Special effects. Another explosion. Same thing. How did that get from A to B? It doesn't matter. Explosion. So, hopefully, video that follows this one, how to win an election. Listen out for short-term thinking. To win people over, to persuade them, you've got to get them into short-term thinking. And one of the best ways, we've mentioned it many times before, is FOMO. Of course, long-term and strategic thinking plays out best. We looked into that one in video 13. Yeah, it takes a bit of brain power and a belief that there's a future worth planning for. I find this one particularly problematic. It seems that, I don't know, it just seems like many people kind of losing faith in the notion that there is actually a future worth planning for, and it's all becoming short-term. Fear of losing, and then the propulsion to gain on the same action is the way to do it. So, our customer, our client, a reader of the book, all they need to do to stop the pain and get a gain is whip out the MasterCard. It's like a giant lever with a fulcrum in the middle, and on one side, if we place fear and we really ramp it up, and then right on the other side, as far away as we can get, create huge contrast to give them a gain, even if it is just something to appease their conscience and to almost mitigate their guilt and shame.